Hi, this is Bonnie, and we are now on our sixth block of the Block of the Month Club. So I want to show you the new block, and this block is called Jacob's Ladder. This was also, I was talking earlier about an Underground Railroad um, blocks, and they all mean something. This is Jacob's Ladder, and this is definitely an Underground Railroad block and a Civil War era block. Let me see if I can get this there. And it meant you were, going to climb the stairway to heaven. And it was a good luck kind of block. It meant that things were safe and going to run as planned. Now you see, I have started putting sashing on, and I wanted to do this because I'm hoping that by next October, when we do the last of the 12 blocks, that you will have almost everything completed that you can go ahead and finish the block for a Christmas gift or finish the quilt. So let me show you very quickly, and I'm going to talk about borders a little bit later. Here was our first block, the butter churn, and then this was broken window. And this one was, I don't remember. This is the Dolly Madison Square. And all of our blocks that we've done so far, I have assembled one row. Now, remember that I am doing a king-sized quilt. So I have assembled 3 color combinations for 3 blocks. So I have just completed my first row because I wanted to start assembling them so you can see what it's going to look like. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And I'll talk about different ways you can do your sashing and your borders. So let's get going on Jacob's Ladder. You can go to the website and you can download the pattern. And this shows you their color combination. It shows you the number of blocks that you're going to need to cut. Then the next page on the download that you're going to do of your pattern, it shows you how to assemble those blocks. You assemble all of your blocks first, your little blocks, and then you start to put them together in your big block. So again, wonderful step-by-step instructions. So we are going to use our neutral colored thread. That way it blends in with darks and lights, but it doesn't stand out too much in the seam line to distract the eye from seeing either one. And I used a multiple of rulers. I used a 6-inch, and I used a 3.5-inch, and I also used a 2.5-inch. It was here a minute ago. It's no longer here. It's here somewhere. Then when I started to cut my border pieces, then I used my very large ruler, and this is a 23-inch ruler, and it has the multiple sizes. It's 6 inches wide. So this way I can start to assemble and cut my border pieces. You would need your scissors, you would need some kind of a marking pen. And let me get started here. And I have all my pieces all cut. And let me just put this very quickly back into place because just now I moved it and I want my ladder to be there. So what I started doing, and I'm going to move the camera down to the table so you can watch. In this block, you are going to do the triangles that you assemble the triangle. You use one light and one dark. You draw a line diagonally down the center from corner to corner. This is now your guideline. Now you're going to stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the guideline on both sides. Once you've finished that, you're going to cut your piece in two. Then you'll be able to open it. Here I have my other blocks already sewn, already cut in two, and this is what you are going to be making. So that would be this step in your block. So the next step that you would be doing, you are going to assemble your squares. So when I cut these, let me get my ruler back. When I cut these squares so that they would be 2 and, let's see, 2 7/8, I guess it says here. And since I'm only doing, say, one block at a time, I'm just going to cut the individual squares. Now, if I was going to do an entire quilt that I needed these squares, I could easily cut strips. I could sew the strips together. The strips would be the same width, and then I could take my rotary cutter or my scissors and cut sections away from the strip. But I decided for this just to go ahead and cut the squares. So now we have assembled this step in our directions. As I've said before, this is a wonderful set of directions, very step by step. So now I'm going to pull my pieces together. Here's a set of squares. Here's a set of squares, a set of squares, a set of squares, a set of squares. And you notice that I didn't let my squares rotate. I made sure that the dark square was always the top right-hand corner when I assembled the block, even the center one. So this would be the top row. And you see here I have, this is assembled, then here's one of my half square triangles, and then the squares are assembled here. So I have now taken and I have done the first few steps. I have put my pattern together, and now I'm able to take my rows. I have done the center row, top row, and bottom row. So double check your pattern, because this one you might not automatically see the design in until you are ready to sew it together. So I'm going to look very carefully at my design, and you're going to see that this is my top row. So it's going to be upside down to me, but it's going to be right side up to you. And you see I have my squares, and here's my cord, half of my block in this bottom right-hand coordinate. So there's the bottom. Now I'm going to assemble the center, and the center piece is this one. And you notice that it has two, this one has two half square triangles versus the first one that only had one half square. Now you see how the ladder is starting to form? I'm going to walk down that ladder or walk up the ladder. And now I'm going to do my bottom row. And now this half square triangle is going to be exactly opposite to this. You notice that they're opposites if they're away from each other. Now, before I go to sew all of this together, I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press all these things. See how nice and flat these are? And I made sure that I pressed every seam nice and smooth. First, I press on the bottom and I press everything in the direction I need it to go. And then afterwards, I flip it over and I press the top. And that sets the seams. The steam heat from the steam iron makes the fibers softer and they're able to bend. And as they cool, they will stay in place and keep that nice, sharp pressing. So I will assemble that one. So now we'll go back and we will look at the square in the quilt. I actually just couldn't wait to get started assembling the blocks. So I decided, well, we'll get started on the sashing. Now let me bring this up a little and see, here's my Jacob ladder. Now, when you are ready to start your sashing, you'll have some decisions to make. Are you going to want your blocks to butt up against each other? Are you going to want sashing in between? I like sashing in between. I think it almost makes it look like a picture frame and you framed your block, but that's entirely up to you. So this is a block. You've seen this a couple of times already. And this is one that I did for the basic quilting class I did last summer or a year ago, I guess, before the shutdown anyway. We had just started on this. We had done the first 2 blocks and then the library shut down. So I finished this online. Now you see on this one, I did my sashing in the same neutral color that I have in my block. On this corner, I chose just to extend my sashing down and make a square corner. I didn't add any color to the center. This one, I chose to add a colored block. So I cut, say my sashing is 3 inches wide. My square for my corner so you would cut this 3.5 inches wide. So you have 1/4 of an inch both sides for your seam allowance. So this corner square, you're going to cut 3.5 inch square. And that's what this block is. And that allows for 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around that block. So that's also a very nice way. You would want to do a contrasting, do your sashing light and your squares dark or vice versa, whichever kind of framing you wanted for your quilt. Now, remember that if you do, the more lights you use in your quilting, the brighter your quilt's going to be. I chose to use this darker red. It's almost a batik. I chose to use this darker red. So my quilt, the finished quilt, is going to look a little bit darker. But there again, this is nice and it's still nice and bright because I have so many light squares. Now I'm going to talk more about, I love to put stars in the corner. I'm a very star person, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So then another corner that you might wish to do is a corner with little squares. Now, if you're going to do a lot of these, you don't want to sit and cut a lot of little 1.5 inch squares. So what you would do, you would take your fabric and you would cut strips, equal width of strips, the green, the light color, and the purple, whichever colors you choose. And you would cut long strips and then sew those long strips together. Press your seams open on down the whole long strip and then cut them off in the width that you want them. So for this, I wanted a 1 inch square when it was sewn. So I cut my strips 1.5 inches square. So I have 1/4 of an inch all the way around for my seam allowance. And then I took and I made another set of strips. This time I had a light, a dark, and a light. Again, I sewed those long strips together. They're 1.5 inches wide, so I have my seam allowance. And then when I finished that, I pressed them and I cut my rows 1.5 inches wide. And that way I have my 1/4 of an inch both top and bottom and on the sides to sew together. So there's many different ways that you can assemble your quilt, assemble your sashing, and this is just a couple. Now I'm going to show you my stars because I really do like the stars. And the stars always take a little figuring out. I do not like a design, a border, anything that it falls off the edge and it's not finished. I love to have the star continue into the border. But because of that, allowing for this, I had to rethink. Now my border fabric is going to have, it's a blue and a brown stripe. So I wanted this blue border to match up against the wide border that I'm going to cut. And I wanted to finish my stars. So since my wide border for finishing my stars, I took and I made, let me measure this. I made 2.5 inch squares, and then I cut the corners off to make the goose tracks, and then folded everything back and pressed it. Now I'm in between. Now I don't have to have such a long continuous strap sashing piece because it's only going to go down the side of each 12.5 inch block. Now, in order to have the star effect, when I do the borders, I have to, on my long sashing strip, I have to put my star points. So I took 2.5 inch squares. I did the same thing when we do the goose tracks. I laid one square into the corner of the border. I did my stitching. I flipped it back. There was one corner done, and then I did the same thing on the other corner. Now I have my points to my star. Then I would do, this is 3.5 inches for this border. So I cut a 3.5 inch square for the center of my star. And I'm going to be able to go down and I can do a whole row of sashing. And that will be my sashing in between. Now, the next thing that I would have to remember is when I do my final row, I did my little pieces so that I could do my points, and then I cut my sashing to fit in between. I have to always remember that I've got to continue on to finish that star. Now, I do a lot of sketching. This is a sketch that I did for a king size quilt. I figured out how wide I needed the quilt to be. Since a quilting machine, if you have it quilted by another person, they can take up to 112 inches on those machines, which is a king size, a larger king size. But the batting in the store when you buy it is only 108 inches. So if you don't want to have to piece the batting all the way around, you're going to want to limit your quilt to 108 inches, so they'll come out nice and even. So I knew that I wanted a king size quilt. My blocks are 12.5 inches unfinished, 12 inches finished. So I took and allowed 6 blocks at 12 inches. And then I took and divided that, or I multiplied that to see how many inches. I subtracted that from the 108. And then that told me how many inches that I still had for my sashing. And so when I did all of that, it came out that if I have 6 12-inch blocks, That's going to give me my king size blocks that each sashing could be 3 inches finished. Then that still allows me about 6 inches for an outside border, depending on how it comes out, maybe 8 inches for an outside border. But I do a lot of little thumbnail sketching like this. I write, I count, I figure. You'll find it on all kinds of little scrap papers by my chair where I get thinking and I write it down. So that's what's happened here. So I hope that you enjoy this Jacob's Ladder. Again, I am at the library all day Tuesday, Friday afternoon and evening, and Saturday. So if you have any questions that you want to come in and ask me, please just bring it in. I will be glad to help you if you're stuck in any way. Follow those instructions that you're going to download. They're wonderful instructions, very step by step. You shouldn't have any problems with them at all. So have another fun month of quilting. We'll meet again next month for block number 7. So enjoy, and if you have any questions, please let me know. My email address for the library is bpeters@clinton.lib.mi.us. Thanks so much. Have a great month, and I'll see you next time.